Hello and welcome to Hot Pursuit, a part of Ahval series, a podcast series. And with me today, from Washington, D.C., Sinan Ciddi, Associated Professor with the U.S. Marine Corps University in Virginia. Welcome, Sinan.
Hi there, how are you doing?
Good to speak to you. Today we are together to chat about the current developments regarding the regime in Ankara, Erdoğan Bahçeli government, the coalition, the alliance that rules Turkey, its domestic policy developments, and key points such as conversion of Hagia Sophia into mosque at one side, Libyan conflict, incursions into Iraqi Kurdistan and Syria, all this turmoil that of which Turkey is the epicenter in the moment. Let's start with your analysis on where the regime is heading. What do you see? What is your reading of it at the moment?
Yeah, these are interesting times as far as Turkey is concerned. I guess the biggest headline that I have, that my main takeaway is essentially that Erdoğan has no domestic message for an increasingly troubled population or citizen body of Turkey. That mainly relates.
But he's trying.
He's trying, but what I mean by that is there is no consistent economic recovery policy. There is no essentially road forward that is institutional, whereby the financial sector, the industrial sector, the public sector has a plan to say how we're essentially going to get back onto a straight and developmental path to normalcy. And that is self-evident. That doesn't require a huge deal of analysis. We've been hearing this essentially worsening since 2010 in all major economic indicators. And as a result of that, due to not having an essential normalcy plan to take Turkey back to, right, he's increasingly resorting to what I would and some others resort to as desperate measures, right? Headline issues to essentially captivate the minds of voters, to say, wow, what an amazing leader. And that relates from anything to, I'm sure we'll get to it, the proposed conversion of the Hagia Sophia church or museum into a mosque again, or extra sort of territorial activities in foreign policy. But essentially, if you look at the bare bones, Turkey is internally headed towards even more difficult times economically, socially, and politically, because there is no substance, right? If you ask what is the economic policy of the government, right, in terms of macro and micro indicators, there isn't one. We keep on talking about, are we headed for elections? What does it matter? What will that achieve? What will that correct? What will that inspire in the citizen body or sort of Turkey watchers, both financially and politically across the world? Not
so you
much.
place no emphasis on elections that are to come in 2023 or before?
Well, I'll say what I said last time. I think we spoke in other outlets that we've spoken is what does an election basically serve at this point? It is basically serving to add the smallest amount of legitimacy to Erdoğan's desire for unimpeded rule, a very small amount of legitimacy to an otherwise autocratic government, right? This person or this administration in Turkey no longer speaks for the majority of the people. If elections were held tomorrow in a free and fair manner, what do we estimate the outcome of that election be? They don't care about that. What they are interested in is adding the smallest shred of legitimacy in an electoral ballot sort of scenario, which will allow them the semblance of retaining power by electoral, quote unquote, victory, but essentially ruling with impunity to serve their own interests for political survival, economic enrichment, and essentially turning the country increasingly into a one-man regime, if that's not already been achieved. So that is what elections are there to serve. It is not time for elections to sort of have a broad consensus to establish a new social contract with the Turkish people. It is the smallest investment you can make to say, I am a legitimate government, right? And that's what he's been resorting to, arguably, since I would say November 2015, when he lost the previous elections just a few months before. He has no other interest. So that my view on that hasn't changed since then.
So what is the solution, viable solution for the opposition, which is also divided? Part of the opposition, main opposition, seems quite passive, focused on investing on elections in normalcy, whereas also the minor nationalist party, E-Party, Good Party, seems to be on the same wavelength. But HDP, pro-Kurdish party, seems more ambivalent, questioning more and more the legitimacy of current parliament, which it starts to see more and more as inefficient, joining the critics, criticizing the current skeleton of the regime as making parliament as redundant. So what, if not elections, what should the main debate be about an acceptable, minimum acceptable future for Turkey and its citizens? This is, I think, the main question which every observer of Turkey is engaged in right now. What is your take?
So I think that's the $1 million question. I think we could spend forever talking about what the HDP's faults are, or the E-Party, or the CHP, etc. And that's all valid, and I think it should be done from a scholarly or policy perspective. Instead of saying that, what I would say is, for the benefit of viewers and sort of trying to make sense of what's going on in Turkey, I would say this: if you're in opposition, it quite often matters what you stand for rather than what you stand against. It's easy to say Erdogan's a menace, the AKP is corrupt, it's taking Turkey down, it's only got its own interests at heart. Fine. What do you stand for? What is your platform? And that has been a problem for the main opposition since Erdogan took power in 2003 as prime minister, right? They were baited with the essential problem notion that Turkey's secularism was ended, and Baykal went along with that bandwagon, but he never proposed what they were standing for as an alternative for Turkey. And that continues across the political spectrum today, whether you are the HDP, whether you are the E-Party, or whether you are the CHP. I'm not even going to talk about the MHP, which we don't consider opposition anymore. But the problem here in all of these parties is they are acting reactively. Oh, if we propose this platform, then we might get hunted down by the Erdogan machine for being too pro-Kurdish, or they're going to tar us with terrorism charges. If we take a more sort of centrist foreign policy approach to criticize upon and sort of put our credentials forward as a pro-West and pro-NATO alliance internationalist, then they're going to tar us with a sellout sort of brush. They're all too intimidated and afraid of what Erdogan might do to them, as opposed to forgetting about that and say, this is the sword we're going to stand on. This is our policy platform, and campaign on that. Your first charge as main opposition party is to have a platform. What do you stand for? And other than just, not proposing anything, you're too afraid of essentially Erdogan's own shadow. And the best example of that is, these ever-going conversations about sort of having a common platform against the AKP. If we appear with HDP side by side, right, they're going to tar us with terrorism. They're going to strip us of our parliamentary status, as Erdogan essentially engaged in a couple of weeks ago, and we don't want to be in that position. So the question is, if you're not willing to take risks to declare to the Turkish people what you stand for, then I have to ask, what is your role as a political party, whether you're the CHP, E-Party, or to a lesser extent the HDP? What is your role? What do you stand for? What are you offering the people? And that, I think, is the biggest problem. And we should all say this by essentially detailing that, just bearing in mind, it's not easy, right? I mean, I don't want to sort of sugar what I'm saying and proposing is not necessarily, I don't necessarily have a plan, but I'm also saying it's not easy to do that, because it is more than an uphill struggle where the major institutions of the country have been routed. Your ability to even present a platform in free media is restricted. Even before taking that road, putting out a positive alternative platform, You have an incumbent, you have a government which preemptively assaults you by stripping your members of parliament of MP status, gets them arrested, to show you that if you actually go down the road of having a credible sort of platform, then I'm going to try and take you down. And so I'm saying it's not easy, but be that as it may, what else are you going to do? And that's my biggest gripe with the opposition, broadly writ. They don't have a robust platform of what they're calling for, and that is achievable, right? You have scores of individuals that you can call upon to put towards an economic platform. You can actually disclose all the malfeasances and lack of transparency in the country that need to be heard by the Turkish people, despite how hard it is. If you're not willing to take those risks, then you arguably shouldn't be proposing to the Turkish people that Erdogan's a menace. We all know that.
What we hear and observe in the past weeks, today also, as we speak, what's debated is former President Abdullah Gül's statement interview, in which he more or less focuses on how bad the economy is going, basically. And these are all sort of observations of opposition figures, such as Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu or Ahmet Davutoğlu or HDP figures. What one hears, I mean, one would agree with your observations, is that they are basically stating these facts without offering anything beyond that. They are saying, oh, this is horrible. Our economy is collapsing. Situation is really horrible, etc., etc. Very bad. They are sending all these signals in a way that most of the people are amongst themselves speak about. But these are, obvious things for people. Things are going bad in general in Turkey, especially in economy. So one would probably take into account what your criticism in the opposition is. But I think another key question is, what is actually Erdoğan and his partner Bahçeli fearing? What are they concerned about? What are their fears? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question.
What do they fear of?
That's a great question. I think just to bounce off your immediate point there with sort of dribs and drabs, whether it's Abdullah Gül or Ali Babacan or Ahmet Davutoğlu, all these sort of former officials sort of criticizing in piecemeal fashion what's wrong with Turkey. We see that in the United States too, right? We have right now, a steady stream of former senior officials within the US government, and we've had a stream of senior officials in the Turkish government, or former senior officials in the Turkish government, over time coming out and saying, yeah, this is not how we envisioned our government or our leader to be, right? And they've taken things too far. I think Abdullah Gül started that sort of trend with his first, his biography that was written by his press secretary a number of years back, where they tried to hide out his more sort of democratic credentials and his kind of disillusion with Erdogan. More recently, Ahmet Davutoğlu and Ali Babacan have come out saying, yeah, we were once part of a great movement. That movement has now been essentially derailed for something else, and we're not happy about it, hence why we're coming forward. But it's dribs and drabs, right? What would be more effective, likely, is a cascade of this, having a platform of individuals that sort of stand and band together and say, we X, Y, Z, whether it's Davutoğlu, Gül, whatever, we all stand by the notion that the movement that we belong to is not the movement that we started out at, right? And what it is now, and what it is doing to Turkey. And it's not just us, but we have come into concerted action with former AKP officials, former senior civil service bureaucrats, also opposition party members. We all have Turkey's interest, and here's our platform. That is difficult to achieve, but nevertheless, I think that would be useful. And not doing that lacks effectiveness in challenging the incumbents, right? So in the United States, we have John Bolton come forward with his book. We had John Kelly sort of bounce off that with a bunch of statements, who's the former White House chief of staff, and other officials and whistleblowers, right? The fact that if you come, dribs and drabs one at a time that can be deflected by the incumbent and just sort of shut down or like discredited or delegitimized or attacked, and in worst cases, you can actually just sort of file charges against these people if that's to take it to the extreme. To go to your question, what does Erdoğan fear is, I think the biggest fear is, what if you can't control the essential function of the bare amount of legitimacy that you've been able to establish through these sham elections, right? The first warning sign of that was June 2015, when essentially I think they were shocked, right? That they couldn't essentially eke out a majority in parliament to continue ruling. I think that, the November election.
June 15, you mean 7th of June 15
yes.
Elections? Okay.
That's right. Yeah, they failed, obviously, for the first time since coming to power in 2002 to eke out a majority. And, that was the most stark sign that they had lost centrist Turkey. That was clear. They had lost Turkey. The big tent, all-encompassing, sort of, I speak for more than my base kind of thing, had disappeared. Since then, they have taken corrective measures to essentially subvert that, whether it's through, torpedoing attempts to form a coalition government between June 2015 and November 2015, right? And since then, basically engaging in a series of snap elections or referenda to essentially manipulate public opinion into passing legislation that ensures their position. The problem right now is even that doesn't work, or it's not likely to work. Even now that they have an alliance with the MHP and Devlet Bahçeli for the last number of years, it is not altogether clear how Erdoğan maintains a majority, right? How do you do that? Because for him to retain the presidency, he needs 50% of the vote plus one. How do you do that? I mean, even if you argue that the parliamentary seat numbers doesn't matter because he can rule by decree, etc., he is showing a fundamental incapability, right, to essentially govern and have Turkey on a stable economic path where social problems are lessened rather than increased. He's not, the imperial presidency that he's put out is not solving problems, and he's feeling increasingly cornered. So what electoral means does he have under his sleeve, or will he put out, to ensure his electoral supremacy? And I don't know if he has an answer to that. The second fear I think he has is probably, what if Bahçeli deserts him? Because right now, everything that is negative happening in Turkey, as perceived by the electorate, is accredited to Erdoğan, not Bahçeli. Bahçeli gets a free pass on this. Erdoğan is the front face of the government. So what if Bahçeli moves away from this sphere, thinking, yeah, I'm not so hot about this. I don't think that's a relationship that Erdoğan has the ability to walk away from. That's
dependent on. Yes.
Right. Third, I think he fears that, I don't think they have a consensus on this, but if they go for snap elections, right, we don't know what impact sort of new parties that have been established are going to have on the electoral result. We all know that the E Party, or not the E Party necessarily, I would say, Babacan's party, Davutoğlu's initiative, if these guys are able to roll out into the electoral landscape in any snap election, we know that they're not going to get a huge percentage of votes, but a percent here or a percent there is going to chip away at Erdoğan's already very fragile lack of majority. We're assuming that if the polls are accurate in some of these outlets, such as Conda, right, Erdoğan doesn't have a majority even with Bahçeli as his alliance member, right? The introduction of new parties, opposition parties, if they chip away at that sort of electoral fortune too, then what does he do? Right, so that's a third fear in terms of, like, do I go for elections? Do I not go for elections? And if I do, what happens if I get a result comparable to June 2015? Right, what do I do? He can't necessarily control it. And I guess the other things he fears is, these are more sort of speculation on my part, is to what extent does he trust the Turkish military, the armed forces, to essentially not engage in further activism, right? Political activism, right? I don't think he has any sort of, because he's closed himself off so much into the palace and very close number of people around him. Do we know for sure that he thinks that the entire armed forces will not engage in another type of coup attempt? I guess that keeps him up at night to a certain extent. And partial explanation of these sort of extraterritorial activities engaged in by Turkey, whether it's Syria, Libya, whatever, some analysts have attributed this to the fact that, he wants to keep the military occupied. I don't know if I believe that, but I think it's got to be a question mark in his head as the major outlier. What happens to him if there is another attempt? Can he stave that off?
I see. These are important points, like 4 or 5 points that may keep him, Erdoğan, and also Bahçeli, sleepless. Some also speak about boycotting the parliament, walking out from parliament. Some express some underline a scenario in which large chunks of AKP deputies desert the party and form something under Ali Babacan's Deva Party or Gelecek Partisi, which may, of course, change the ground of parliament, although not necessarily challenge the presidential system per se. But those are also the points that are being spoken about. But the main question remains the same again, that the system with which Turkey is run and managed is changed from top down radically from 16th of April 2017, and all the steps being taken as we speak now, they continue, because you just touched upon the electoral system, 50+1 or whatnot, and also maybe a change amendment that will make it impossible to form election alliances, etc., all in favor of, to the advantage of maintaining the power structure as it is now. And the main question is, so much dismantlement is done of the old structures of the republic, that many are questioning whether or not point of no return is passed, is that everything, what is reversible, what is not reversible. And some pessimists say it will take a very, very long time for Turkey to come to life again, or to come to breathe again normally out of this coma. What do you think?
That is a very good sort of point of conjecture, and sort of, the long road ahead in terms of what does Turkey look like, and do we think it's too late? I've often surmised about this sort of oscillating between pessimism and optimism. But if we have to sort of put our hat down and say, okay, let's look at this from a sort of atmospheric position, just looking at Turkey from 35,000 feet, I think the damage is extensive, right? One indicator: Turkey's spending reports, government spending reports, have not been open to scrutiny and audit since, I believe, 2012. The average citizen or regulatory bodies in Turkey, the Sayıştay and the Danıştay, have no ability, right, to essentially audit the government's spending. We don't know how the government runs. We don't know how paychecks get issued, how money is distributed. What does that mean? We have no idea how our government is financed or essentially run. And I fear that if we do one day discover that, I think it will be very disconcerting and shocking to a lot of citizens, as well as analysts and financial backers. Just that alone says to me that Turkey has been unaccountable for a great amount of time. And it is accountable because it's built on a regime now, or a system of government, that I consider to be illegitimate, right? The Turkish presidential system is not legitimate. And I say that because from a political science perspective, the transition from a parliamentary to a presidential system was put on a piece of paper saying, do you accept this or not? And barely 50% of the population said yes, barely, with lacking full access to free and fair information as to what that would entail. Even I don't necessarily know what that would have entailed. I mean, I read as extensively as possible what the new powers of the presidency would be, but the average citizen wouldn't have even looked at this beyond going and voting. Can you really rely upon 50% or just over 50% as a mandate to completely alter the system of government that a country has been ruled by, in terms of political accountability to the people, sovereignty, all these mega questions and meta questions in one referendum question? I would suspect not. You can ask, in a Swiss style, should parents be allowed to essentially, withhold their children from, mandatory public education in a sort of referenda style? Again, that's a big question, but I can see that you can put that toward a referendum. But can you really put the public sort of interest of how they are governed through one referendum, whether Turkey gets to be ruled by an all-powerful president, one-man rule, versus a parliamentary system, which was less than perfect, and get the people to decide on that? I honestly have a problem. If you had an 80% approval, that's one thing. 50% plus one is very troubling. The third point to build off that is, what does Turkey look like? Is because of those two things I mentioned. I think the country is going to find a very hard way back to institutional governments, because both the declaration of the imperial presidency, but also lack of financial accountability and auditing of the government for nearly a decade now, right? We're losing muscle memory as to how an accountable system of government was managed. We look like Azerbaijan. We look like Uzbekistan, right? That's where we're headed, in terms of an unaccountable, all-powerful. And Turkey is a pluralist country. And I'm not talking about democratic rights and freedoms, but a plurality of interests, whether it's economic interests. We have economic interests in the European Union, in Southeast Asia, with our partners, across the world. That's a plurality of interests. We are members of NATO, the Western European Union. All of these major sort of competing interests that Turkey has to, or traditionally had to sort of weigh in a system of bureaucratic government, right? One person or a small cabal of individuals advising one person cannot devise policies which situate the country in a politically, economically, and militarily competitive position. We just can't answer those questions. And since the transition to a presidential system in April 2017, it has been abundantly clear that Turkey is not surviving. It is not meeting the call of pluralist interests in a global, regional, and domestic measure, right? Erdogan's trying to micromanage everything, whether it's in terms of, who should be arrested, what's the outcome of X trial, who gets what public contract or tender, what we do inside of NATO, right? We are seeing that that's not leading anywhere. And in order for Turkey to come back to an even keel as a country, what we need is, steadfast move to institutional governments. Mm-hmm. You're right. I think if you just remove the presidency and take the country back to a parliamentary democracy, how are we going to establish those institutional sort of measures and checks and balances and the muscle memory of, for example, the National Security Council in Turkey weighing into security policy, foreign policy? How do we get the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right, back to a position of advising the government and the presidency or the prime minister, right? None of these people are being utilized. We all see the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, all the, what I would call the sort of more astute, level-headed individuals who've chosen to remain and serve, right? These are individuals who essentially are not in a position of advising. They're just doing what they're told. And then there are the sort of pariahs who essentially have taken to the road of actually bellicosing the president's message, right? There's a complete transformation of individuals. We've seen a complete shift in political and public culture in Turkey, right? Hyperbole to sort of cheering on an increasingly autocratic leader. I think it's very hard to reverse those trends. And there are more sort of ancillary veins that feed into this beyond the political realm. I mean, you could talk about, the impact of, cleaning out the education sector, right?
Right. Many parts. Yeah. All those components are there as part of the overall decay. One point seems rather clear, though: the determination of the current coalition of AKP, MHP, Erdoğan and Bahçeli, symbolized by them, to walk all the way through to 2023, centennial of Turkish Republic. Right. Arguably with the outlook of a republic as a full-fledged security state, as perhaps, as you mentioned, comparable to Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, or something like that. That is one widespread view, that this determination will lead to such a closure. But one key element to achieve that, if that's the way that we see, is the foreign policy, rather militarization of foreign policy, as we see in many aspects. The Foreign Office is, you mentioned the education, Foreign Office is basically sidelined. The old core of diplomats are nowhere to be seen, nowhere to be heard. Even ex-diplomats are refraining from talking clearly and being outspoken. All those issues are clear. Then we have the foreign policy as we see it. Is it this key element? Some argue that this key element, especially the involvement in Libya, the engagement in Blue Homeland, the so-called, basically taking control of a sea basin in the East Mediterranean, may come to spell the end of all aspirations as such, as I mentioned, security state, full control, perhaps start to spell end of the current power structure in Ankara. Would you agree, or how do you analyze the Libyan crisis and East Mediterranean involvement and developments there? We can end up our conversation with that. I think that's an important part of it.
Yeah, that's a very broad and good question too. I mean, because it has so many moving parts. What we've seen in Syria, we were exclusively focused on what Turkey's foreign policy was in Syria up until recently, with the ongoing civil war, and then obviously that sort of projected out into North Africa, specifically Libya. The first thing I would say is that I honestly can't project where this is going, but I agree with you. I don't think it's going anywhere good, right? The reason I say that is, first of all, just very practical basis. Foreign entanglements, as in foreign wars that countries get engaged in, or military operations, these are extremely costly items. Not necessarily just in terms of lives, but also, which is probably arguably the most important, I would say, but also in terms of financial impact. I mean, this is not cheap. Bankrolling military efforts, whether you are taking Syrian fighters into Libya, whether you are transporting weapons, munitions, or establishing bases across the world in places like Qatar or the African Horn, etc. These are astronomically expensive ticket items, right? But the basic point about this is Turkey simply does not have the means to essentially to carry these out. And even if it did, the best way of going about this would not have been unilateral in terms of saying, I'm going to have a position in Libya, I'm going to have a position in Syria, right? I'm going to establish main bases in Qatar or in Somalia, whatever, right? But the force multiplier in which Turkey achieved its broad, foreign policy objectives was through force multipliers like NATO, right? Arguably the best foreign policy investments that Turkey's ever made historically, that really projected Turkish interests out onto the map. Now, Erdogan's essentially wanted to sort of do away with that to the extent that he hasn't felt like Turkey's really being taken seriously, or he hasn't really been able to pursue his agenda within conventional channels. But the opportunity was there to increase Turkey's role and presence across the world stage. He once astutely, I would say, came close to resolving the Cyprus imbroglio, right? Very close in 2004. We all remember that. And it's the only time I give Erdogan a considerable amount of credit to investing so much political capital as well as foreign policy capital to resolving this issue. And its failure was no fault of his, I would argue. But the way he has gone about this since then, he essentially believes that everybody thinks like him. If the European Union is not going to make good on its promises with regards to Cyprus, then I'm essentially going to take the road I want with no repercussions, right? And because that's what everybody does. He hasn't really chosen to follow a foreign policy approach writ large in a constructive manner. That's the sort of broad point. In terms of actual motivations as to why we're involved or why the country is involved in Syria, but more so in Libya, has anything but to do with strategic interests, right? Now, arguably, you can say, well, as a result of his alliance with the legitimate government of Libya, Turkey now has staked a claim into gas and oil exploration in the Eastern Mediterranean because the Libyans have recognized Turkey's exclusive economic zone. Fine. Maybe that's a strategic interest. But you're now essentially taking a strong position against Israel, Egypt, Cyprus, Greece, the European Union, arguably, and who knows, the United States, right? Saying,
and France.
And France, right? And you are leading to a level of brinksmanship, right? That is not going to end well, arguably, right? We don't know. And I think he's trying to push all these cards. Because, like I said at the beginning of this, he has no domestic policy to sell at home, whether it's a strong economic message towards its citizens, this, in terms of how Turkey's going to be politically put back onto an even keel, but by projecting a strongman approach on the international arena, by saying we're going after our rights, we're going to take a stand and principled foreign policy, we have a legitimate claim in Libya and the Eastern Mediterranean, we're going to pursue that. Does he hope that that's going to get him sort of extra brownie points at home? Maybe. But I think, some of your previous sort of contributors to this program have also sort of noted, well, what if this ends up in a military confrontation down the road? I don't think we have an answer to that, right? And I think the big major point to make about all of this is he's going to try and want to achieve a lot of these prior to the November US elections. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is the key objective, because
that one is important. I think it has to do with all the eggs that Erdogan placed in Trump's basket.
Right. Yeah, because tomorrow, if the elections were held tomorrow in the United States, Trump would be wiped out. We have 4 months to go, or just over 4 months to go, until the US elections here. I think Turkey and a lot of other actors are starting to calculate that Trump might essentially self-implode, right? If that happens, right, then Trump will remain in power until January, right? And that gives Turkey Erdoğan a very small window of opportunity to pursue objectives while the United States ignores those, right? Because it's all, it all seems apparent that Biden's foreign policy and national security team that is likely to be shaped up is going to be interested in bringing back a sense of normalcy or accountability, or let's just say stability, into an increasingly volatile part of the world, which has a lot of US interests as well as Western interests, right? Nobody's interested in conflict in the Near and Middle East. It stands to reason that the Biden team, if they are successful, will want to bring calm and also, not to mention that the United States is likely to unroll, right, or continue to pursue under a Biden administration the continuity of a lot of charges and malfeasance and sanctions evasion, all the truckload of stuff that Erdogan has feared, right, that the United States prosecutors have brought against him in the Halkbank case, right, and sanctions evasions, et cetera, et cetera. Those will likely go back to an increased sort of schedule. So I don't think he has a long window of opportunity to get these things finalized or sort of push the card out so much. He's relying on Trump to essentially continue to give him the carte blanche in the region until November. Mm-hmm. And Trump's going to be too distracted to pay attention to what Erdogan's doing. I don't think the administration here cares. So we shall see. But my major point about sort of what's this all, rolling out of different plans and headline issues in the region, it's not strategic. It is targeted solely to sort of gain sound bites for Erdogan, to try and sell to a domestic public opinion which is less receptive to these than it ever has been. There is a limited number of fights a government can pick in times of economic turmoil, but also, which is now also being compounded by a global pandemic, which has seriously crippled Turkey further economically. So it stands to sort of question, what can he achieve with any of these? And other than sort of encouraging regional conflicts, which could really damage Turkey, I don't think it achieves much else.
If the revived aspiration of Erdogan as the leading force of what remains of Muslim Brotherhood stream, movement, ideology, leadership of such, with Libya as experimental ground, would it not be a strategic goal? One
of the things I've always thought about, and this is not my area of expertise, but I I subscribe to this view. The Arab world is the Arab world, right? And Turkey does not understand the Arab world. It never has. It doesn't understand why,
Not even Turkey's Islamists understand, you mean?
I don't think Turkey's Islamists understand it either. They think they understand it. They think they have a legitimate voice within it, right? But I would venture to say that Turkey does not have a keen and astute sort of understanding of Arab politics and Arab political dynamics in the region, right? I don't think they can appreciate that if Erdoğan continues to take an escalatory position towards Egypt, I don't think he gets the idea that a sizable part of the Arab world is going to likely stand behind behind Egypt. That is, and he also doesn't understand why the Arab world has an vested interest in taking a strong position in Syria. We don't understand this because Turkey does not speak Arabic. We don't understand Arab dynamics in the region historically, right? We haven't even come to a clear understanding of why the Arab revolts took place historically that ended the Ottoman Empire, right? But because we feel we should have a stake in it, or because we feel historically we were the Ottoman Empire, then we should be in a sort of natural leading position to unify and have a strong voice within a Muslim Brotherhood-led region, does not necessarily mean that anyone's going to listen to it, take it into account, or be bullied by it. I just don't think that the administration in Turkey gets this. And I don't think we'll get it, right? We just lack the nuanced understanding of the region for that.
I see. One final question. It's a $20 million question, which nobody seems to figure out. Regarding Bolton's book, John Bolton shed a lot of light on Trump-Erdoğan relations. And it's easy to figure out what Erdoğan gains out of this relationship. But even Bolton himself seems without a response to what Trump gets out of this relationship. Yeah. Why does Trump support Erdoğan so, let's say, unconditionally? What is in it for him? Do you have any answer to that?
I don't. That is the $1 million question, and I've been asking.
You lost your 20 million.
To people, I said, what's behind this? Why would he's not getting much out of this, right? Any sort of answers that I've gotten that when I've asked this question is the extent that I think Bolton alluded to this too in his interview, a couple of press interviews that he's done on TV subsequent to the publication of the book, which I haven't read, by the way, yet. Suggests that Trump just likes giving out favors and essentially calling those in when he said when he needs to. That he likes he's had this sort of collaborative relationship with strongmen like Erdoğan and doing favors with people such as that, and that's evident in his historical relationship with other oligarchs, business people in his past, I believe. It's
like franchising power.
Yeah, well, that's a great term. Yeah, franchising power. Yeah, that's. But the other sort of speculative thing that I've heard is to suggest that who knows what kind of business entanglements that the Trump sort of household has with Turkey. We know about the towers that exist in Istanbul, right? Has there been anything else struck in the vicinity of Erdoğan, Trump, or the son-in-law sort of Jared Kushner realm, right? That keeps Trump holding off from taking a more sort of ambivalent position towards Erdoğan. And if indeed Trump does lose the election, it seems to me that in the time between November, when the election takes place, until January, when he would have to leave office, Trump, right? There's a 3-month delay, right? That would be Trump's opportunity to essentially go for a fire sale, saying, I'm leaving office. What do you need from me, right, that I can do for you and you can do for me? So in the case of Turkey, it could very well be the case that, Erdoğan has specific asks of the United States or from the Trump administration. Before you leave the office, do X, Y, Z for me, right? And I can ensure
as we say in Turkish, dile benden ne dilersen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is, yes, it is speculation, but we know this White House and the increasing amount of literature that's come out and coming out and will likely to come out is that there are a lot of financial entanglements of this administration that, with multiple actors, whether it's Russian oligarchs, the Russian presidency itself, other European, the Trump family has been engaged in these for decades, right? So it may very well be the case that there is a more robust financial conflict of interest relationship between Erdogan and Trump that will only sort of materialize subsequently down the road that we don't know about. But as I said, like I said, I don't have the answer to the 20 million question. But it seems to me, my mind's going more there in terms of a sort of, money transaction, right?
Sinan Ciddi, Associate Professor with U.S. Marine Corps University, Virginia. Thank you, Sinan, for this wonderful conversation. And we hope to ask more questions to you in the future.
I look forward to it. Thank you.